Flatbread. Flatbread is the oldest category, and in a meaningful sense, it is not bread at all by the risen definition. It is simply cooked dough. No fermentation, no leavening, no gluten development beyond the minimum required to hold the shape. Flour, water, salt, heat. The result is dense, chewy, and unleavened, and it has been the dietary staple of most of human civilization for the majority of recorded history.
The oldest confirmed bread-like food dates to around 14,000 years ago in what is now Jordan. Flatbreads made from wild cereal grains, browned and mixed with water, and cooked on hot stones by the Natufian people, roughly 4,000 years before the advent of agriculture. This is significant because it means bread preceded farming. Humans were not making bread because they farmed grain. They were in part farming grain because they already knew what to do with it.
Lavash, the paper-thin flatbread of Armenia and the broader Caucasus region, is perhaps the most technically demanding flatbread to produce. The dough is stretched by hand over a rounded cushion and slapped directly onto the interior wall of a tanir, a clay pit oven with live coals at the base. It cooks in under a minute, blistering and charring slightly on contact, and emerges as a large, irregularly shaped sheet that is crisp when fresh and pliable when stacked and stored. UNESCO recognized lavash as an intangible cultural heritage of Armenia in 2014. The technique has remained essentially unchanged for at least 3,000 years.
Injera, the spongy sourdough flatbread of Ethiopia and Eritrea, sits at an interesting intersection between flatbread and fermented bread. It is made from teff, tiny grain native to the Ethiopian highlands, high in iron and calcium and naturally gluten-free, fermented for 2 to 3 days in a clay vessel until it becomes pleasantly sour. The batter is poured onto a large clay griddle called a mitad and cooked in a single layer with a lid, steaming from below and above simultaneously. The fermentation produces both carbon dioxide and lactic acid. The CO2 creates the characteristic spongy, porous texture full of tiny holes, and the lactic acid gives injera its distinctive tang. It is simultaneously the plate and the utensil, torn and used to scoop stews from its surface.
Sourdough. Sourdough is not a flavor. It is a method, specifically the use of a live fermentation culture containing wild yeasts and lactic acid bacteria rather than commercial yeast to leaven bread. The culture is a self-sustaining ecosystem maintained by regular feeding of fresh flour and water, and it is different in every kitchen, every city, and every country where it exists. The specific wild yeasts and bacteria present in a given starter are shaped by the local environment, the flour, the water chemistry, the ambient temperature, and the microorganisms naturally present in the air and on the baker's hands.
The lactic acid bacteria in a sourdough culture, primarily species of lactobacillus, produce both lactic acid and acetic acid as they ferment. Lactic acid contributes a smooth, yogurt-like sourness and softens the crumb. Acetic acid, produced in larger quantities at lower hydration levels and cooler temperatures, contributes a sharper, more vinegary edge. The ratio between the two acids is what defines the flavor profile of a given sourdough loaf, and it is controllable, to a degree, by the baker through hydration, fermentation time, and temperature. The wild yeast in the culture produces CO2 more slowly than commercial yeast, which means fermentation takes hours or overnight rather than minutes, and that extended time allows for a depth of flavor development that commercial yeast cannot replicate. The earliest confirmed evidence of sourdough fermentation dates to ancient Egypt, around 6,000 years ago. For most of human history, sourdough was simply how bread was made, because commercial yeast did not exist. The isolation and commercialization of Saccharomyces cerevisiae in the 19th century made leavening faster, more predictable, and cheaper, and sourdough largely disappeared from mainstream bread production. Its resurgence in the late 20th and early 21st centuries is best understood as a correction, a recognition that what was lost in predictability was not worth what was lost in flavor, texture, and nutritional complexity. Pita. Pita is one of the most efficient bread designs ever developed, and it works by controlled internal explosion. The dough is rolled thin, around 3 to 4 millimeters, and placed in an extremely hot oven. Traditionally, a wood-fired stone floor at temperatures above 230 degrees Celsius.
The surface of the dough sets rapidly from the heat, trapping steam generated from the water inside. The internal pressure from that steam inflates the entire round into a balloon within 60 to 90 seconds. When removed from the oven, the balloon collapses as it cools, leaving behind the characteristic pocket, a separation of the two cooked layers that is the defining structural feature of the bread. Pita has been made across the Levant and broader Middle East for at least 4,000 years, and its pocket is not merely a textural curiosity. It is a functional container. The ability to fill a piece of bread with meat, legumes, herbs, and sauces without the filling falling out is a genuine engineering solution to the practical problem of portable food. The gyro, the falafel wrap, the shawarma, each of these is a direct function of what pita's internal architecture makes possible.
The baguette is France's most recognizable cultural export in food form, and its origin is more recent and more bureaucratic than most people expect. The long, thin shape was not a French invention driven by aesthetics. It was a practical response to a labor law. In 1919, France passed legislation prohibiting bakers from beginning work before 4 in the morning. The traditional round miches of the time required several hours of bulk fermentation and proofing, making it impossible to have bread ready by the time bakeries open. The baguette, with its thin profile and dramatically reduced proofing time, solved the problem. It could be shaped and baked quickly enough to meet the new legal constraints.
The chemistry of a good baguette is specific and demanding. The dough has a high hydration, around 75%, and very little fat or sugar, which means the gluten network must develop through folding and time, rather than aggressive kneading. The thin shape maximizes the ratio of crust to crumb, and the crust is the point. The exterior of a properly baked baguette undergoes intense Maillard browning in a deck oven loaded with steam, producing a crackingly rigid shell that shatters when bent and a crumb that is open, slightly chewy, and pale. The flavor is almost entirely in the crust. The crumb is mild and weedy, a vehicle for the caramelized, nutty, complex flavor that lives in the browned exterior. A baguette is, structurally, a delivery system for crust. In 2022, the art of French baguette making was added to UNESCO's Intangible Cultural Heritage List, a designation that recognizes not just the object, but the knowledge, the daily ritual, and the social role of the neighborhood boulangerie in French life. Brioche. Brioche is bread that has crossed the line into pastry, or pastry that has maintained the pretense of being bread. It is made with flour, eggs, butter, sugar, and yeast, and the butter content alone, typically between 40 and 60% of the flour weight, places it in a category entirely separate from lean doughs. That much fat coats the gluten strands as they form, inhibiting the development of a strong, elastic network. The result is a crumb that is extraordinarily tender, almost feather-like, with a richness that comes from both the fat and the eggs, and a faint sweetness that sits just below the threshold of dessert. The technique for making brioche is deliberately slow. The butter must be added in small increments after the gluten has partially developed, so the fat can be incorporated without completely destroying the structure. The dough must then be cold retarded, chilled overnight, both to firm the butter for easier shaping and to slow the fermentation to a rate that allows flavor development without overproofing. Brioche baked without this cold rest tends toward blandness. The overnight fermentation is not a convenience. It is a flavor-building step. Brioche has been made in Normandy since at least the 15th century, where the combination of rich dairy culture, the same region responsible for butter, cream, and camembert, and wheat production made it a natural local product. It became a symbol of French bourgeois excess and is the bread most likely implicated in the phrase attributed to Marie Antoinette about letting people eat cake, though there is no credible historical evidence she ever said it. What is historically verifiable is that brioche was expensive, labor-intensive, and unavailable to most people, which made it an efficient symbol regardless of who was referencing it. Rye bread. Rye bread is what happens when gluten fails. Rye flour contains glutenin and gliadin in much lower quantities than wheat, and the rye grain also contains a high concentration of pentasans, complex carbohydrates that absorb water aggressively and compete with gluten proteins for hydration. The result is that rye dough cannot develop the strong, gas-retaining gluten network that wheat dough relies on. Instead, rye doughs depend on starch gelatinization and the gummy matrix formed by pentasands to provide structure. Crumb of a dense rye bread is not held up by gluten bubbles. It is held together by a starchy gel. This has two practical implications. First, rye bread requires acid, either from sourdough fermentation or added acidulants, to deactivate an enzyme called amylase that would otherwise break down the starch during baking before it has a chance to gelatinize and set. Without sufficient acidity, rye bread collapses into a gummy, dense mass. Sourdough and rye have coexisted for this reason since the grain was first cultivated in Central and Eastern Europe around 2,000 years ago. Second, rye bread has a genuinely different flavor profile from wheat bread. Earthy, slightly bitter, with a dark molasses note in heavily baked versions, and a fermented tanginess that wheat bread rarely achieves. Pumpernickel is the most extreme expression of rye baking. Traditional Westphalian pumpernickel contains only whole rye kernels and rye flour, no added yeast, and is baked at very low temperatures, around 100 degrees Celsius, for 16 to 24 hours in a sealed tin. At that temperature and over that duration, a non-enzymatic browning reaction called the Maillard reaction occurs extremely slowly throughout the entire crumb, not just the surface, producing the characteristic near-black color, deeply sweet, almost chocolatey flavor, and dense, moist, almost waxy texture. It is less a baked product than a slow-cooked one. Focaccia is one of the oldest documented leavened breads in the Western culinary record, with origins in ancient Liguria in what is now northwestern Italy. The Romans made a version of it called panis focaccius, bread of the hearth, baked directly on the floor of the oven or on heated stones, a technique that predates modern baking equipment by centuries and gives the bread its characteristic thick, chewy base and deeply browned underside. Modern Ligurian focaccia is defined by a specific relationship between olive oil and dough. The dough has a relatively high hydration, around 80%, which makes it too wet to knead conventionally, and requires the baker to use a series of stretch and fold techniques to develop the gluten without adding flour. After an initial bulk fermentation, the dough is pressed into an olive oil-lined tray, dimpled aggressively with the fingers, each dimple a reservoir for the olive oil and brine that is poured over the surface, and proofed a second time before baking. The olive oil does two things simultaneously. It conducts heat to the bottom of the bread during baking, creating a crust with the texture of a shallow fried surface, and it coats the surface of the dough, inhibiting moisture evaporation and producing a top that is simultaneously crisp and tender. The flavor is weedy, savory, and saturated with olive oil in a way that is unambiguously Ligurian. Bánh mì. Bánh mì is the most historically compressed bread on this list. The French introduced the baguette to Vietnam during the colonial period in the mid-19th century, and within decades, Vietnamese bakers had developed their own version so distinct from the original that it constitutes a genuinely different bread. Vietnamese bánh mì uses a combination of wheat flour and rice flour, which produces a lighter, crisper, more shatteringly thin crust, and a crumb that is airier and less chewy than a French baguette. The rice flour reduces gluten development slightly, which is precisely the point. The result is a shell that fractures rather than bends, a structural property that is as much aesthetic as practical. The bread itself is only part of the story. Bánh mì as a complete object, the sandwich emerged in its recognizable form in Saigon in the 1950s, combining the French baguette format with Vietnamese fillings, pickled daikon and carrot, cilantro, chili, cucumber, and various combinations of pâté, grilled pork, and head cheese. The result is one of the most balanced sandwiches in the world, simultaneously hot and cool, rich and acidic, fatty and herbal, and it exists entirely because two food cultures were forced into contact by colonial history, and the Vietnamese kitchen absorbed, modified, and ultimately improved upon what it was given.